In a world where Sansa Stark, the young lady who had been tormented and manipulated by Joffrey Baratheon, makes the bold decision to push him to his death at the Purple Wedding, the entire landscape of Westeros is thrown into turmoil. What would happen if Sansa, driven to her breaking point by the cruelty of King Joffrey, had killed him herself, sparking a chain reaction that would echo through the Seven Kingdoms? The death of Joffrey Baratheon was one of the most shocking moments in the history of Westeros. The image of the sadistic boy king choking on his own blood, poisoned at his wedding feast, is burned into the minds of the people. But what if it had been Sansa, instead of poison, who had been the instrument of his death? If she had pushed him from his seat, her moment of defiance could have sparked an entirely different series of events, shifting the power dynamics in King's Landing and the entire realm. The first immediate consequence of Joffrey's death would be chaos in King's Landing. Without the usual royal advisors present to control the situation, the court would descend into utter confusion. Cersei Lannister, already weakened by the growing power of the Tyrells, would be unable to contain her fury. She would feel betrayed and enraged, not only by the murder of her son, but also by the idea that Sansa had dared to defy her in such a public, violent way. The Lannisters' grip on the throne would be shaken, and with no immediate successor to the throne, the question of who would ascend would ignite fierce competition. Without Joffrey, Cersei would find herself alone with Tommen, who was still far too young to rule. The Tyrells, always keen to secure their position in the capital, would undoubtedly seize this opportunity to push for Margaery Tyrell's ascension as queen. However, the Tyrells' influence would not go uncontested. The death of Joffrey would bring not only political upheaval but personal revenge, and the power struggle between the Lannisters and the Tyrells would be inevitable. Sansa, as the presumed murderer, would be forced to flee from King's Landing to avoid the wrath of Cersei and the Lannisters. Her actions would be seen as both an act of vengeance and a challenge to the Lannister regime, and the repercussions would not only affect her personally, but the fate of her family as well. Sansa would be labeled as a criminal hunted across the realm. Yet there could be some who would see her as a hero, someone who stood up to the cruelty and injustice of the Baratheon Lannister bloodline, someone who took matters into her own hands in the face of unspeakable torment. At Winterfell, the news of Joffrey's death would spread quickly, reaching the ears of her family. Catelyn Stark, who had always been cautious about the political maneuvers of the Lannisters, would likely feel a sense of grim satisfaction at the news, though she would remain conflicted about her daughter's role in the assassination. Robb Stark, now king in the north, would view his sister's actions with a mixture of pride and concern. While he would understand her decision to take justice into her own hands, the political ramifications would be overwhelming. Robb would have to consider how this would impact his position in the ongoing war with the Lannisters and how it might affect any potential alliance between the North and the South. Sansa's actions would also shift her relationship with Petyr Baelish. Littlefinger, ever the schemer, would recognize the power shift caused by Joffrey's death and would see an opportunity to further his ambitions. He would likely offer Sansa an alliance, seeking to use her newfound prominence to advance his own goals. Sansa, however, would be far more cautious in her dealings with him. The trauma of her past experiences, particularly with the manipulation she suffered at the hands of men like Baelish and the Lannisters, would make her more wary and less trusting of anyone seeking to use her for their gain. But Littlefinger would also see her as an asset, a tool to further his claim to power in the chaos following Joffrey's death. Meanwhile, the other houses of Westeros would respond to the news of Joffrey's death in various ways. House Martell, still nursing the wounds of the Red Wedding and the death of their beloved Oberyn, would see this as a moment of revenge fulfilled. They would undoubtedly support the idea of weakening the Lannisters, and the murder of Joffrey would be seen as a form of justice in their eyes. Doran Martell, ever the patient strategist, would likely begin planning for the Martells' future involvement in the politics of Westeros, seeing Sansa's actions as a sign that the Lannisters' hold on the throne was weakening. However, the death of Joffrey would also have far-reaching consequences for the Baratheons. Stannis, already engaged in his own battle for the throne, would see the death of Joffrey as an opportunity to claim legitimacy. The war for the Iron Throne would intensify, with various factions vying for power, and Robb Stark's role in the North would become increasingly critical. If Sansa had killed Joffrey, it would not be a simple matter of her taking justice into her own hands. It would have sparked a broader conflict, one that would embroil the entire continent in a vicious struggle for power. The religious faction, led by the High Sparrow, would also take an interest in this development. The Tyrells, who had previously worked with the Lannisters to maintain control over the capital, would now find themselves in a precarious position. Their alignment with the Lannisters would no longer be as secure, and the rise of a new power in the capital, one backed by Sansa's defiance of the Baratheons, would challenge the existing social order. The death of Joffrey Baratheon at the hands of Sansa Stark would be a game-changer for the entire realm, leading to unforeseen political and personal consequences. As the ripple effects continue to unfold across Westeros, the power struggle intensifies, reshaping alliances and forcing the great houses to react. One of the immediate long-term impacts would be the destabilization of the Lannister family's hold on the throne. Cersei Lannister, devastated by the loss of her son, would be consumed by rage and grief. Her need for vengeance would push her to take drastic measures, not just against Sansa, but anyone who could potentially challenge her power. Cersei's emotional state would impair her decision-making, making her far more reckless than she already was. Her thirst for vengeance would drive her to make mistakes, potentially alienating her allies and even her own family. The Lannisters, usually so calculating, would now be driven by raw emotion. Tommen, the innocent and naive child who would inherit the throne in the wake of Joffrey's death, would be thrust into an impossible situation. Cersei, who would try to rule in his name, would find herself torn between her desire to maintain the Lannister grip on power and her overwhelming need to protect her remaining family. With Joffrey's death still fresh in everyone's minds, the people of King's Landing would no longer view the Lannisters with unquestioning loyalty. Public opinion would shift, with many seeing Cersei as a tyrant and a murderer. While Tommen would be a pawn in Cersei's schemes, the growing dissatisfaction among the people would make it increasingly difficult for her to rule with the same iron fist that her son Joffrey had once held. In the North, the consequences of Sansa's actions would also be profound. Robb Stark, already entrenched in his own war for the North's independence, would see his position further complicated. While the North would rejoice at Joffrey's death, seeing it as justice for the suffering his family had endured, Robb would have to carefully navigate his relationship with the South. The Lannisters' hatred of the Starks would intensify, making peace talks or alliances all the more difficult. Sansa's actions would force Robb to reconsider his strategies and alliances. He could no longer afford to be seen as neutral or distant from the political turmoil in the South. The North would be forced to act, either by pursuing war against the Lannisters or, in the event of strategic marriages, attempting to consolidate power and take advantage of the chaos in King's Landing. However, the Stark family's relationship with the Tyrells would grow more complex. Margaery Tyrell, now the widow of the dead King Joffrey, would likely be in a precarious position. The Tyrells would be more cautious in their dealings with the Starks, knowing that an alliance with them could easily put them in direct opposition to the Lannisters. Margaery, who had once hoped to marry a king, now found herself grieving the death of her husband and trying to maintain her family's power. Her marriage to Joffrey had been a political move, but with his death, her future was uncertain. Margaery would likely look to Sansa for guidance and potential collaboration. Sansa, now seen as a symbol of defiance, could play a significant role in securing the Tyrell's position, possibly even encouraging a future union between Margaery and a Stark, or even Stannis Baratheon, who might see the marriage as a way to solidify his claim to the throne. While Sansa's relationship with the Tyrells grows more intricate, her interactions with the remaining Baratheons would become increasingly tense. Stannis Baratheon, still claiming his right to the Iron Throne, would view Sansa's role in Joffrey's death as an opportunity to further his cause. He would see Sansa as a useful tool, especially as her defiance against the Lannisters could bring him more support. Stannis, ever the pragmatist, would likely approach Sansa with a proposal, an alliance in exchange for her support of his claim to the throne. But Sansa, having endured so much at the hands of the Baratheons and the Lannisters, would be far less willing to trust Stannis or anyone else seeking to use her for their ambitions. While Sansa tries to maintain her position in the capital, she would struggle with her own moral compass. She would never be the same person who had once been a naive girl dreaming of a marriage to a handsome prince. The trauma and pain she experienced would shape her into a stronger and more independent figure. But at what cost? Would she ever find peace after taking Joffrey's life? The weight of his death would follow her, as would the knowledge that her actions had irrevocably altered the future of Westeros. Every choice she made from that point onward would be shaped by that moment of violence. As for the people of King's Landing, the death of Joffrey would serve as a rallying cry for the disenfranchised. The common people, who had long been subjugated under the reign of the Lannisters and Baratheons, would begin to view Sansa as a symbol of resistance, a stark contrast to the cruelty and oppression they had long endured. Word of her act would spread, and many would see her as a liberator, a woman who fought against the tyranny of the throne. This newfound respect from the common folk would only fuel the conflict, creating a divide between the nobility, who would see Sansa as a dangerous insurgent, and the peasants, who would look to her as a hero. In the end, Sansa's decision to kill Joffrey would change the course of Westeros forever. The Lannisters would be thrust into disarray, their hold on the throne weakened, and the entire political structure of the Seven Kingdoms would shift. House Stark, while caught up in the resulting chaos, would find themselves positioned differently than ever before, able to seize opportunities that had once been closed off to them. The story of Sansa Stark, from a pawn in the Game of Thrones to a player in her own right, would become one of the most talked about and debated moments in the history of Westeros. In her quest for justice, Sansa would rewrite the future of the realm, and in doing so, would secure her place in the annals of history as one of the most powerful and unexpected figures to ever rise from the ashes of war and betrayal.